Margaret Chun pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway of the Steinberg Concert Hall, the wheels squeaking softly in the empty building. It was past 11 at night, and the last of the evening's audience had long since gone home. This was her favorite time to work, when the grand building belonged only to her, and the ghosts of all the beautiful music that had filled these walls. She had been cleaning this concert hall for 12 years now. 12 years of mopping the same floors, dusting the same seats, and emptying the same trash bins. Most people would find it boring, but Margaret found peace in the routine. There was something comforting about bringing order to chaos, making everything clean and ready for the next day's performances. Tonight felt different, though. As she walked past the main auditorium, she could hear piano music drifting through the heavy wooden doors. This was unusual. The building was supposed to be empty by 10 o'clock. She paused, listening to the complex melody that seemed to dance through the air. Whoever was playing was incredibly talented. Margaret had always loved music, though she rarely spoke about it to anyone. When she was young, back in Taiwan, music had been her whole world. But that was a lifetime ago. Now she was just a cleaning lady in Chicago, invisible to most people who passed her in the hallways. She continued with her work, but the music kept drawing her attention. The pianist was playing something classical and difficult. She recognized it as Rachmaninoff, though she couldn't remember which piece exactly. It had been so many years since she had studied classical music seriously. As she worked her way closer to the auditorium, the music suddenly stopped. Then it started again, then stopped. The pianist seemed frustrated, playing the same section over and over, each time stopping at what must have been a particularly challenging part. Margaret knew she shouldn't be curious. Her job was to clean, not to wonder about the musicians who used this space. But something about the struggle in that music called to her. She had once known that feeling, the frustration of trying to perfect a difficult passage, the way your fingers would stumble over notes that looked simple on paper, but felt impossible to play. She finished cleaning the lobby and moved on to the smaller practice rooms. The main auditorium would be her last stop of the night. As she got closer, she could hear the pianist's frustration growing. The music would start beautifully, then crash into discord when he hit that same troublesome section. From outside the door, she could hear him muttering to himself in what sounded like Russian. His voice was getting louder and more agitated with each failed attempt. Margaret had encountered difficult artists before during her years of night cleaning. Musicians could be temperamental, especially when they were preparing for important performances. She decided to wait outside until he finished. There was no point in interrupting someone's practice session, even if it was past the building's official closing time. She sat quietly on a bench in the hallway, listening to the repeated attempts at the same musical passage. After about 20 minutes, the music stopped completely. Margaret heard footsteps inside the auditorium, then the sound of someone talking angrily on the phone. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Whoever was in there was not having a good night. She waited a few more minutes, then knocked gently on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time. Finally, she heard footsteps approaching the door. The door swung open to reveal a tall, thin man with wild dark hair and an expensive suit that looked like he had been wearing it for too many hours. His eyes were tired and irritated, and he looked at Margaret with the kind of expression that suggested he wasn't happy to be interrupted. "Building is closed," he said in heavily accented English. "You should not be here." Margaret held up her cleaning supplies and pointed to her uniform. "I work here," she said simply. "Night cleaning crew. I clean the auditorium every night after performances." The man looked her up and down, taking in her worn uniform and tired face. His expression shifted from irritation to something that looked almost like amusement, but not the kind sort. "Ah, the cleaning lady," he said, stepping back into the auditorium, but leaving the door open. "Well, come in then. Do your job. Don't mind me." Margaret wheeled her cart into the beautiful space. The auditorium was dimly lit, with only the stage lights illuminating the magnificent grand piano in the center. The man walked back to the piano bench and sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. You know anything about music, cleaning? Lady? He asked without looking at her. Margaret began emptying the trash bins in the aisles. A little, she said quietly. The man laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. A little, of course. Everyone knows a little about music. Everyone thinks they understand what it takes to play like this. He gestured toward the piano. This is Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2. You know what that means? Margaret continued her work, not wanting to engage too much with this clearly frustrated musician. It's beautiful music, she said. Beautiful music, he repeated mockingly. Yes, it is beautiful. It is also impossible. This passage here, he played a quick section that immediately dissolved into discord. This passage is driving me crazy for 3 hours now, 3 hours. He stood up from the bench and began pacing around the piano. Do you know who I am? He asked suddenly. Margaret looked up from her cleaning. Should I? This seemed to surprise him. Victor Volkov, he said, as if the name should mean something to her. I have played in every major concert hall in Europe. I have recorded 12 albums. Critics call me one of the most talented pianists of my generation. Margaret nodded politely and continued working. And yet, Victor continued, his voice rising slightly, I cannot master this one section. This one tiny piece of music that should be simple for someone of my caliber. He sat back, down at the piano, and tried the passage again. Once again, it fell apart halfway through. He slammed his hands down on the keys in frustration, creating a harsh noise that echoed through the empty auditorium. Maybe you need to take a break, Margaret suggested gently. Sometimes when we try too hard, we make things more difficult than they need to be. Victor turned to look at her with an expression of disbelief. Take a break? I have my Carnegie Hall debut in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I cannot take a break. Carnegie Hall, Margaret remembered that name from her youth, when such venues had seemed within reach. Now it felt like something from another world. Entirely. You think this looks easy? Victor asked suddenly, his tone becoming mocking again. You think anyone can just sit down and play Rachmaninoff? Margaret didn't answer. She had learned long ago that it was better to stay quiet when people were upset. You know what? Victor said, standing up again. His eyes had taken on a strange gleam. Why don't you show me how easy it is? Come here, cleaning lady. Show me how to play this impossible passage. Margaret stopped cleaning and looked at him. Uncertainly, I should finish my work, she said. No, no, Victor insisted, gesturing dramatically toward the piano bench. You said I should take a break. You said I was making it too difficult, so show me how simple it really is. There was something cruel in his voice now, as if he was enjoying the idea of watching her fail at something he couldn't master. Himself, Margaret recognized this tone. She had heard it before from people who thought that cleaning ladies couldn't possibly understand anything beyond mops and trash bins. I really should finish cleaning, she said again, but Victor was already pulling out the piano bench. Come, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just for fun, what harm could it do? Margaret stood frozen in the middle of the auditorium, her cleaning cloth still in her hand. Victor was waiting by the piano bench with that cruel smile on his face, clearly expecting her to back down in embarrassment. The silence stretched between them like a tight rope. She looked at the magnificent piano on the stage. It was a Steinway Grand, the kind of instrument she had only dreamed of playing when she was young. The black surface gleamed under the stage lights, and she could see her reflection in the polished wood. For a moment she wasn't a tired cleaning lady in a worn uniform. She was 18 years old again, standing before her first real concert. Grand, what's wrong? Victor asked, his voice dripping with fake concern. Having second thoughts? Perhaps playing piano is not as easy as you thought? Margaret set down her cleaning supplies. Something inside her chest was stirring, something she had kept buried for so many years that she had almost forgotten it existed. It felt like a tiny flame that had been sleeping under cold ashes, suddenly beginning to warm. She walked slowly toward the stage. Each step felt strange, as if she was walking through a dream. Victor watched her with amusement, probably thinking this would be entertaining. He had no idea what he had just awakened. As she climbed the steps to the stage, memories began flooding back. The feel of piano keys under her fingers, the way music could make time stop, the joy of finding the perfect balance between technique and emotion. All of it came rushing back like water breaking through a dam. She approached the piano bench. Victor stepped aside, still wearing that mocking smile. "Please," he said with exaggerated politeness, "show me how it's done." Margaret sat down slowly. The bench felt familiar despite all the years that had passed. She placed her hands in her lap and looked down at the keys. They seemed to glow in the stage lights, black and white patterns that held infinite possibilities. Her hands were different now than they had been 40 years ago. They were rough from years of cleaning, with small scars and calluses that told the story of a working life. But as she lifted them toward the keyboard, something magical happened. The years seemed to fall away. She placed her fingers on the keys without playing anything yet. The touch felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. Victor was standing beside the piano, waiting for her to embarrass herself so he could have a good laugh, but Margaret wasn't thinking about Victor anymore. She was remembering her teacher back in Taiwan, an elderly woman who had taught her that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes. "Music comes from here," she used to say, pointing to her heart. "Technique is important, but without soul, it's just noise." Margaret closed her eyes and began to play. The first notes that came from the piano were soft and careful. She started with a simple scale, letting her fingers remember the feel of the keys. Victor's smile began to fade as he realized that she actually knew what she was doing. Then Margaret began playing the very passage that had been giving Victor so much trouble. But she didn't play it the way it was written in the music book. She played it the way she felt it should sound, with all the pain and beauty that life had taught her since she was young. The music that filled the auditorium was unlike anything Victor had heard before. It was technically perfect, but that wasn't what made it special. What made it special was the depth of feeling behind every note. This wasn't just someone playing Rachmaninoff. This was someone who had lived enough life to understand what Rachmaninoff was trying to say. Victor's mouth dropped open. He sank into a nearby chair, forgetting completely about his cruel joke. The cleaning lady he had tried to humiliate was playing with the skill of a master and the heart of someone who had known real struggle. Margaret's eyes were still closed as she played. In her mind, she wasn't in a concert hall in Chicago. She was back in her childhood home in Taiwan, playing for her parents who had worked extra jobs to pay for her music lessons. She was playing for her younger brother who used to sit quietly and listen whenever she practiced. She was playing for all the dreams she had given up and all the music that had lived silently inside her for so many years. The difficult passage that had frustrated Victor for 3 hours flowed from Margaret's fingers like water. She didn't just play the notes correctly, she made them sing. Each phrase told a story, each harmony painted a picture. The music rose and fell like breathing, like life itself. Victor found himself leaning forward, completely mesmerized. He had studied this piece for months, had analyzed every measure and practiced every technique, but he had never heard it played like this. Margaret was teaching him things about the music that no conservatory professor had ever shown him. As the passage came to an end, Margaret didn't stop. She continued playing, moving into other sections of the concerto as if she had been rehearsing it her whole life. Her rough hands moved across the keys with grace and confidence that seemed impossible for someone who spent her nights cleaning office buildings. The auditorium filled with music that seemed to have a life of its own. It wasn't just beautiful, it was necessary, like air or water. Victor realized he was hearing something that very few people ever get to experience, pure musical truth. When Margaret finally stopped playing, the silence that followed was profound. Neither she nor Victor moved for a long moment. The last notes seemed to hang in the air, reluctant to fade away. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a beautiful dream. She looked down at her hands on the keyboard, surprised to find them there. For a few minutes, she had forgotten where she was and who she had become. She had simply been herself again. Victor was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on anyone's face before. It was a mixture of shock, respect, and something that might have been shame. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words. "How?" he finally whispered. Margaret stood up from the piano bench, suddenly feeling self-conscious again. The spell was broken, and she was once again a cleaning lady in a worn uniform. But something had changed inside her. The flame that had been sleeping was now fully awake. "I should finish my work," she said quietly, turning away from the piano. "No, wait," Victor said quickly, standing up from his chair. "Please, I need to understand. That was extraordinary. How did you learn to play like that?" Margaret picked up her cleaning cloth from where she had dropped it. "It was a long time ago," she said. "But where did you study? Who was your teacher?" "That kind of technique doesn't come from nowhere." Margaret began walking back toward her cleaning cart. She could feel Victor following her, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Please," he said again. "I have been playing piano for 30 years. I have never heard anyone play Rachmaninoff like that. You made me understand things about the music that I never knew before." Margaret paused at her cart, her back still turned to Victor. The truth was heavy inside her chest, like a stone she had been carrying for too many years. Part of her wanted to tell him everything, but another part of her was afraid that speaking about her past would somehow make this moment less real. "We all have stories," she said finally. "Some of them we keep to ourselves." Victor walked around to face her. His eyes were different now. Humble, curious, and full of genuine respect. "Will you tell me yours?" he asked softly. Margaret looked at Victor's face and saw something she hadn't expected. The arrogance was completely gone. In its place was genuine curiosity and respect. She had spent so many years being invisible that having someone truly see her felt strange and overwhelming. She sat down on the edge of the stage, her legs suddenly feeling weak. The music had awakened so many memories that they were flooding through her mind like a movie playing too fast. Victor sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance but close enough to listen. "I haven't told this story in a very long time," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most people wouldn't believe it anyway." Victor waited patiently. He seemed to understand that pushing would only make her retreat back into silence. Margaret took a deep breath and looked out at the empty auditorium seats. "When I was little, back in Taiwan, I was what people called a prodigy." That seems like, such a strange word now. "My parents discovered I could play piano when I was only 4 years old." She smiled at the memory, though tears were starting to form in her eyes. "We had this old, beaten-up piano in our tiny apartment. It was missing some keys and was terribly out of tune. But to me, it was the most beautiful instrument in the world." Victor listened without interrupting, sensing that these words had been locked inside her for decades. "My mother worked in a factory and my father drove a taxi. They weren't educated people, but they recognized that I had been given something special. So they did something incredible. They started saving every penny they could to pay for my music lessons." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. "They would eat less food, wear old clothes, and never buy anything for themselves. Oh, so their daughter could learn to play piano properly. When I think about the sacrifices they made..." She had to pause, overcome by emotion. "By the time I was 8, I was performing in competitions all over Taiwan. I would practice 6 hours a day after school, and I loved every minute of it. Music wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. I couldn't imagine life without it." Victor found himself completely absorbed in her story. He had grown up with wealthy parents who could easily afford the best teachers and instruments. He had never had to watch his family sacrifice for his musical education. "When I was 15, something amazing happened," Margaret continued. "A visiting professor from Juilliard heard me play at a competition. Do you know what Juilliard is?" Victor nodded. Every serious musician knew about the prestigious music school in New York. He said I had the most natural musical talent he had seen in years. He arranged for me to audition for a full scholarship, Can you imagine? A girl from a poor family in Taiwan getting the chance to study at one of the world's best music schools. Margaret's eyes were shining now with the memory of that long-ago excitement. I spent 2 years preparing for that audition. My teacher said I was ready to compete with students from anywhere in the world. My parents were so proud. They told everyone in our neighborhood that their daughter was going to study in America. She stood up and walked over to the piano, running her fingers gently along its edge. I got the scholarship. Full tuition, room and board, everything. I was going to start at Juilliard when I turned 18. It felt like all my dreams were coming true at once. Victor could sense that the story was about to take a dark turn. The happiness in Margaret's voice was fading, but life has a way of changing all your plans in a single moment, she said quietly. 2 months before I was supposed to leave for New York, my father had a heart attack while driving his taxi. He died instantly. The auditorium fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Victor felt his chest tighten with sympathy. My mother was devastated. She couldn't work for months because of her grief. My younger brother was only 12 and needed someone to take care of him. The family savings that weren't already spent on my music lessons had to go to funeral expenses and basic survival. Margaret sat back down, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the memory. I tried to find a way to still go to Juilliard. I called them, explained the situation, asked if I could defer for a year, but scholarships don't wait for family tragedies. They gave my spot to someone else. Victor wanted to say something comforting, but he knew that no words could erase the pain of a dream lost so young. So I stayed home and became the family provider, Margaret continued. I took whatever jobs I could find to support my mother and brother. I told myself it was temporary. I thought maybe in a year or two, when things were stable, I could try again. She laughed, but it was a sad sound. You know how life works. 1 year became 2, then 5, then 10. My brother grew up and went to college. My mother remarried a kind man who could take care of her, but by then I felt like it was too late for me. I was 28 years old and hadn't touched a piano. Seriously, in 10 years. Victor shook his head. 28 is not old for a musician. You could have started again. Margaret smiled sadly. That's what young people always think. But when you've been away from something that demanding for so long, it feels impossible to catch up. Plus, I had convinced myself that maybe I hadn't been as talented as everyone thought. Maybe losing that opportunity was a sign that music wasn't really my path. She pointed to her hands. These hands that used to create beautiful music were now washing dishes, cleaning offices, doing whatever work I could find. I came to America because I thought there would be more opportunities here. But without education, without connections, I could only find jobs that paid enough to survive. Victor looked at her hands and saw them differently now. Those calluses and scars weren't just signs of hard work. They were evidence of dreams deferred and sacrifices made. For 20 years, I avoided pianos completely, Margaret admitted. It hurt too much to remember what I had lost. Then I got this job cleaning the concert hall 12 years ago. At first, I tried to work around the music. I would clean the practice rooms when they were empty, avoid the main auditorium when there were performances. She gestured around the beautiful space they were sitting in. But slowly, being around music again started to heal something inside me. I would listen to the performers rehearse and remember why I had loved playing so much. Sometimes, when I was sure no one was around, I would sit at one of the practice pianos and play a few notes, just to remember what it felt like. Victor was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had witnessed. That's why you could play Rachmaninoff so beautifully tonight. You never really stopped being a musician, Margaret nodded. Music isn't something you forget, like riding a bicycle. It becomes part of who you are. Even when life takes you away from it, it stays inside you, waiting. She looked directly at Victor for the first time since she had started telling her story. When you challenged me to play tonight, you probably thought you were making fun of a simple cleaning lady, but you actually gave me something I hadn't had in 40 years. What's that? Victor asked. You gave me permission to be myself again, even if it was just for a few minutes. Victor felt ashamed of his earlier behavior, but also amazed by the strength and grace of the woman sitting beside him. Margaret, he said softly, what happened to you was unfair. But your talent is still there. It's stronger and deeper than it ever was when you were young. Margaret stood up and picked up her cleaning supplies. Maybe so, but some chances only. Come once in a lifetime. Mine came and went 40 years ago. Victor watched her prepare to leave, and suddenly he knew he couldn't let this story end here. Victor stood up quickly as Margaret started to walk away. His mind was racing. He had come to this concert hall tonight frustrated and angry about his own problems, but now he realized how small those problems really were. Here was a woman who had lost everything and still managed to play with more soul than he had ever heard. Wait, he called out. Margaret stopped but didn't turn around. Please just wait one moment. She stood perfectly still, her back to him, holding her cleaning supplies. Victor could see the tension in her shoulders. She had shared something deeply personal with him, and now she probably regretted it. I have an idea, Victor said, his voice filled with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. What if I told you that your chance hasn't passed? What if it's just beginning? Margaret turned around slowly, confusion written across her face. What do you mean? Victor began pacing around the piano, his mind working faster than it had in months. My Carnegie Hall debut. It's in 6 weeks. What if you performed? With me? Margaret stared at him as if he had lost his mind. That's impossible. I'm a cleaning lady, not a concert pianist. No, though, Victor said firmly. You're a musician who happens to work as a cleaning lady. There's a big difference. He walked over to her, his eyes bright with possibility. Margaret, what you played tonight was extraordinary. I've heard the best pianists in the world, and none of them moved me the way you did in those few minutes. Margaret shook her head. You're being kind, but this is crazy. I haven't performed publicly in 40 years. I don't have the stamina, the practice, the preparation. Carnegie Hall is for real musicians, not for people like me. People like you? Victor asked. You mean people with real stories to tell? People who understand what music actually means? He sat down at the piano bench and played a few notes of the Rachmaninoff passage. I can play this perfectly now, thanks to hearing you. But for months, I've been playing it without any soul. Do you know why? Margaret didn't answer, but she was listening, because I've lived an easy life, Victor continued. I've never had to sacrifice anything important. I've never lost a dream and had to start over. My music is technically perfect, but it's empty. What you have is what every musician dreams of having, the ability to make people feel something real. Margaret set down her cleaning cart and walked closer to the piano. Even if what you're saying is true, 6 weeks isn't enough time. I would need months of preparation, maybe years. And even then, I could never perform at Carnegie Hall. The pressure alone would destroy me, Victor smiled. What if I told you that I've been preparing for this performance for 8 months, and tonight, listening to you play for 10 minutes, I learned more about this music than I had in all that time? He stood up and gestured toward the empty auditorium. Margaret, I've been thinking about this all wrong. I've been trying to prove that I'm the best pianist in the world. But what if instead I use this performance to tell a story that actually matters? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Victor could see that she was considering his words, even though part of her wanted to run away from this impossible idea. What kind of story? She asked finally. Your story, Victor said. The story of someone who never stopped being a musician, even when the world told her she had to. The story of dreams that survive even when everything else falls apart. Margaret sat down in one of the auditorium seats. The weight of possibility was almost too much to bear. Victor, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you don't understand how terrifying this would be for me. What if I fail? What if I embarrass myself in front of thousands of people? Victor sat down beside her. What if you succeed? What if you show the world that it's never too late to reclaim who you really are? For the next hour they talked. Victor told Margaret about his own fears and insecurities. Despite his success, he admitted that he often felt like a fraud. He had technical skill, but he had always struggled to connect emotionally with his music. Hearing her play had shown him what he was missing. Margaret told him more about her years of silence, about how she had convinced herself that her musical dreams were selfish when there were bills to pay and family to support. She had spent so long being practical that she had almost forgotten how to dream. "My manager is going to think I've lost my mind," Victor said with a laugh. "He's been planning this Carnegie Hall debut for 2 years. The marketing, the press, the ticket sales, it's all built around me as a solo performer." Margaret felt a flutter of panic. "See? This is exactly why this won't work. You have contracts, obligations, a reputation to protect. You can't risk all of that on someone like me." "Someone like you is exactly what my career needs," Victor said. "I'm tired of playing perfect, empty music for people who only care about technical precision. I want to do something that matters." They talked about the practical challenges. Margaret would need intensive coaching to prepare for such a high-level performance. She would need new music arrangements, stage training, and help dealing with the media attention that would inevitably follow. "The press will have a field day with this story," Victor warned. "They'll want to know everything about you. Some will be supportive, but others will be cruel. They'll say it's a publicity stunt, that I'm making a mockery of classical music." Margaret had been thinking about the same thing. Maybe they'll be right. Maybe this is just a beautiful idea that could never work in the real world. Victor played a few more notes of the Rachmaninoff. "When you played this tonight, did it feel like a publicity stunt? Did it feel fake or calculated?" "No," Margaret admitted. "It felt like coming home." "Then that's all that matters," Victor said. "Everything else is just noise." As the night went on, Margaret found herself getting caught up in Victor's enthusiasm. He began describing how they could arrange the Rachmaninoff as a duet, with parts written specifically for 2 pianos. He talked about other pieces they could perform together, music that would showcase both technical skill and emotional depth. "We would need to practice together every night," Victor said. "It would be intense, exhausting, probably the hardest thing you've ever done." Margaret thought about her current life, the long nights of cleaning, the invisible existence, the feeling that her best years were behind her. "It couldn't be harder than spending the rest of my life wondering what if," she said quietly. Victor's face lit up. "Does that mean you'll consider it?" Margaret looked around the beautiful auditorium where she had spent so many quiet nights. She thought about the young woman she had been, full of dreams and possibilities. She thought about her parents who had sacrificed so much to give her a chance at something extraordinary. "If we do this," she said slowly, "it has to be real. Not a gimmick or a feel-good story, but a genuine musical performance that honors the music and the audience." "Absolutely," Victor agreed. Margaret took a deep breath. The practical part of her mind was screaming that this was impossible, reckless, a recipe for disaster. But there was another voice, one she hadn't heard in 40 years, that was whispering something different. "Okay," she said, so quietly that Victor almost didn't hear her. "Okay," Margaret stood up, her decision made. "Let's do it. Let's see if dreams really can come back to life." Victor's smile was so wide it seemed to light up the entire auditorium. "Margaret, you just made the best decision of both our lives." As Margaret gathered her cleaning supplies for the last time in this role, she realized that tomorrow night she wouldn't be returning as a cleaning lady. She would be coming back as a musician, ready to reclaim the identity she had thought was lost forever. The 6 weeks that followed were the most intense of Margaret's life. Every evening after finishing her day job, she would meet Victor at the concert hall for hours of practice. Her fingers, unused to such demanding work, were often sore and stiff. But with each passing day, she could feel her musical abilities returning stronger than before. Victor had kept his word about making this a real musical collaboration, not just a publicity stunt. He arranged for Margaret to work with a voice coach to help her project confidence on stage. He brought in a professional accompanist to help them perfect their duet arrangements. Most importantly, he treated her as an equal partner, not as a charity case. The media attention started slowly but quickly grew into something neither of them had expected. A local newspaper picked up the story first, writing about the cleaning lady pianist who would perform at Carnegie Hall, then a national morning show called Wanting to interview them both. Margaret was terrified of the interviews at first. She had spent so many years being invisible that suddenly having cameras and microphones pointed at her felt overwhelming. But Victor stayed by her side, helping her find the confidence to tell her story in her own words. Not everyone was supportive. Some classical music critics wrote harsh articles questioning whether Carnegie Hall was becoming a circus rather than a serious venue. Online comments ranged from encouraging to cruel, with some people calling the whole thing a desperate publicity stunt. Maybe they're right, Margaret said one evening after reading particularly nasty comments on social media. Maybe I don't belong on that stage. Victor stopped playing and turned to face her. Do you remember how you felt that first night when you played Rachmaninoff? Like I was myself again, Margaret admitted. Then that's all that matters, Victor said firmly. We're not doing this for the critics or the internet commenters. We're doing this for everyone who has ever been told their dreams were too late or too impossible. As the performance date approached, Margaret's nerves grew stronger. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing as she imagined forgetting the music in front of thousands of people. Victor was nervous too, but for different reasons. This performance would either establish him as a serious artist or potentially damage his career forever. 3 days before the show, disaster almost struck. During an intense practice session, Margaret's wrist began hurting severely. A doctor's visit revealed inflammation from the sudden increase in playing time. The doctor recommended rest, which was the last thing they could afford with so little time left. We can postpone, Victor offered, though they both knew that would likely mean canceling altogether. Margaret looked at her swollen wrist and made a decision that surprised even herself. No, we've come too far to stop now. I'll manage the pain. The night of the performance arrived with more media attention than either of them had imagined. News crews lined the streets outside Carnegie Hall, interviewing audience members about their expectations. Some people had bought tickets specifically to see if the cleaning lady pianist would succeed or fail spectacularly. Margaret arrived at the venue 3 hours early, her hands shaking as she put on the elegant black dress that Victor had insisted on buying for her. It was the first formal gown she had owned since she was 18 years old. Looking in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Victor found her in the green room, staring out the window at the crowds gathering outside. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "Terrified," Margaret answered honestly. "What if I freeze up? What if my fingers don't work? What if I let you down?" Victor sat beside her. "Margaret, 6 weeks ago you were invisible to the world. Tonight, whether you play perfectly or not, thousands of people will know your story. You've already won." As showtime approached, they could hear the murmur of the audience taking their seats. Margaret peeked through the curtain and saw the massive hall filled with people. Her legs felt weak at the sight. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed through the venue, "please welcome to the stage Victor Volkov and Margaret Chun." The walk onto the stage felt like it lasted forever. The audience applauded politely, but Margaret could sense their curiosity and skepticism. Many of them had probably come expecting either a miracle or a disaster. Margaret sat at her piano bench and placed her hands on the keys. The lights were so bright she couldn't see individual faces in the audience, which was somehow comforting. Victor sat at his piano nearby, giving her an encouraging nod. The first piece they had chosen was a gentle arrangement that would allow Margaret to warm up gradually. As she played the opening notes, something magical happened. All her nervousness disappeared. The massive audience faded away. She was no longer a nervous cleaning lady pretending to be a pianist. She was simply a musician, sharing her gift with the world. Victor watched in amazement as Margaret transformed before his eyes. The woman who had been trembling with fear just moments before was now playing with complete confidence and grace. Her interpretation of the music was even more beautiful than it had been during their practice sessions. As they moved through their program, Margaret grew stronger and more confident. The audience, which had started out skeptical, began to lean forward in their seats. Something special was happening on that stage, and everyone could feel it. The highlight of the evening was their duet arrangement of the Rachmaninoff Concerto, the same piece that had brought them together 6 weeks earlier. As they played, their two pianos seemed to have a conversation, with Victor's precise technique perfectly complementing Margaret's emotional depth. Margaret's wrist was throbbing with pain, but she pushed through it, knowing this might be her only chance to perform on this stage. Every note carried the weight of her 40-year journey, the dreams lost, the years of struggle, and the unexpected second chance when they reached the final passage, the same one that had frustrated Victor so much that first night. Margaret played it with such beauty and power that several people in the audience began to cry. She wasn't just playing music. She was telling the story of every person who had ever given up on their dreams and found the courage to try again. The last note hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. Then the audience erupted. The standing ovation went on for 15 minutes, with people whistling, cheering, and many openly weeping. Victor and Margaret stood together, holding hands and taking bow after bow. In the days that followed, videos of their performance spread around the world. Margaret received thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories of abandoned dreams and finding inspiration in her courage. But the real change wasn't in the fame or attention. Margaret discovered that she didn't need to become a touring concert pianist to reclaim her identity as a musician. Instead, she used her newfound platform to start a music program for adults who thought it was too late to pursue their artistic dreams. She kept her day job for a while, but now it felt different. She wasn't an invisible cleaning lady anymore. She was a musician who happened to clean buildings, and everyone who worked with her knew about her extraordinary talent. Victor's career was transformed as well. The performance established him not just as a technical master, but as an artist who could connect emotionally with his audience. More importantly, his friendship with Margaret taught him that the most beautiful music comes from the most authentic places. 6 months later, Margaret stood once again in the Steinberg Concert Hall where it all began. But this time, she wasn't there to clean. She was there to teach piano to a class of adult students who had thought their musical dreams were over. As she watched her students discover the joy of making music, she realized that some dreams don't end. They just find new ways to grow. And sometimes, the most beautiful music comes not from those who never stopped playing, but from those who found the courage to start again.